Thanks so much, Julie, and welcome everybody. So nice to see so many faces and see where you're coming from. I am in Boulder, Colorado, where it is cold, but with no precipitation right now. As you may be able to hear, I'm also originally from the UK, where apparently there is precipitation and it's very cold. So let's dive in. The first question, hopefully an easy starter for 10, is what is it that everybody remembers about Joseph? Probably thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. You put it in the chat. He had a coat of many colors. Exactly. His coat, his psychedelic clothing. Exactly. You all got it. So that is where I want to find our way into this morning's study, or this afternoon study for some people. The other question is, good, I see people adding more things, dreams, Potiphar's wife, and some jealous brothers. Where else does anybody remember, where else does clothing, what other garments do we see in this parsha beyond Joseph's coat of many colors? I don't know the Dolly Parton song. I'll check that out. Someone else says that Judah, who's another of Joseph's brothers, there's a section of the story about Judah and his relationship with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Right. So Judah has garments. We'll see. We also see Joseph leaving his clothing with Potiphar's wife. Tamar also wears an outfit, a kind of a disguise, to represent herself as something she isn't really. Right? She's dressed like a prostitute. Good, Sarah. Joseph's coat is dipped in blood to convince Jacob that he's been killed, where he in fact hasn't. And then Potiphar's wife grabs Joseph's cloak and he runs off, and then she uses the cloak that is left with her to claim that he assaulted her. Very good. Between the group, we've basically got everything. So, Julie, at this point, you could put the link to the source sheet into the chat and maybe share the screen as well. Thanks so much. Before we dive in, I want to, as an opening, I want to go over this idea of pardes. I'm sure some folks here are familiar with the idea that the Torah can be approached in multiple different ways. And one sort of framework for this is the idea that there are 4 levels. Pshat, pardes, and pardes is the acronym. P for pshat, which means, good, Diana, Jacob tears his garment when he hears that his son has died. That's a sign of mourning, and he dresses in sackcloth. Very good. So these 4 levels, there's exegetical principles I put at the top of the source sheet. Julie, are you able to share the screen so we can look at the source sheet together? There's exegetical principle that we can look at the Torah through 4 levels. P for pshat, meaning the literal level. R for remez, or re'iyah, meaning the kind of allegorical or some kind of hints or allusions. D for drash, meaning something like, you can scroll down a little bit. Oh, maybe I should be the one to share my screen, then I can. Drash, to inquire, so same word as midrash. So sometimes it's like wordplay, sometimes it's sort of like this word occurs here in one text and here in another text, so we form an association between them. And then sod, the mysterious level, the esoteric level. So I had to say that myself, I've never been quite sure how to distinguish between remez and drash, and if anyone has a nice way that they think about it, I'm very keen to hear your framework, how you differentiate. And as I made the source sheet, my uncertainty about that can maybe be seen. There are possibly sources I've put in remez that you would say, oh, but really that's drash, and sources I've put in drash that you would say, oh, but really that's remez. Okay, well, forgive me. It's just a way of introducing certain ideas. So we basically covered already the pshat because you all are brilliant students. So let's just kind of scroll. You can do a rolling scroll, Julie, and anyone who wants to read these sources later can, well, as usual, I've put way more on this source sheet than we'll probably get through. You will mention Tamar. Oh, pause 1 sec. One thing that wasn't mentioned is that not only does Tamar disguise herself to seduce her father-in-law, Judah, who has not given her in marriage to his third son, she's entitled to marry, but she says she needs a pledge from him, and he gives her his seal and cord and staff. And then a few months later, when it's discovered that she's pregnant, and they accuse her of illicit behavior, she brings out the cord and seal and staff and says to Judah, "Do you recognize these?" So it's not exactly a garment, but it's sort of a garment, and it's used to move the story along similarly. Okay, we can keep going. And then the third incident is that of Potiphar's wife, who, you just pause here for a sec, Julie. You can see how many times the word garment is repeated. It's actually 5 times in this short section. The garment is a kind of key piece of evidence, as someone pointed out, yeah, sort of maybe again kind of referencing back to the original coat that everybody remembers, Joseph's coat of many colors. And then there's one other thing. This doesn't come from this parsha. It's actually in 2 parshiyot by Yigash, that when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he gives them new clothes. And to Benjamin, possibly we would say unwisely, continuing this theme of sibling rivalry, he gives 5 changes of clothes. So, but we see kind of nice full circle with clothing and special status here. Okay, so remez, hints and allusions, and in a second I'm going to open it up for a little conversation. The Hebrew word for garment is beged, right? I'm sure some people know that. But if you look in the dictionary, the first entry you see for these letters, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, which you also might notice are the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th letters of the alphabet, of the Aleph Bet, is the verb to act or deal treacherously, which is pretty interesting, right? That there's an inherent connection between how we clothe ourselves and some sort of deception. So I guess this is my my first question. Oh, Stuart points out, well, we're going to get into exactly the nature of this coat. This is good. We'll get into that in a sec. I'll put that under Remez Andrash. So what do we make of this connection between clothing and treachery? And indeed, anything that anyone wants to say about these stories that we've opened with. And if you want to, can you unmute yourself? Are you able to unmute yourself, or do we have to invite you? Okay, so you have to like raise your hand using the little reactions button in the bottom of the screen so that we can see to unmute you. And you're also welcome to just type into the chat if you're more comfortable with that. Clothing helps them with deception. Right, so clothing is used actively as a disguise, as we see with Tamar in particular. A wolf in sheep's clothing, very nice. Yep, how people present themselves is not always how they are. It's an allegory for how one covers up. One can look poor or rich, so it's a way of representing, and it could hide the true essence. Oh, good. Someone mentions Adam and Eve, and which we'll hopefully have time to come to at the very end. Good, beautiful. And the whole idea of nakedness and clothing that comes in at the very beginning of our human story. Wonderful. Lisa says it could be deception or simply perception, which differs what's on the inside and what's on the outside. Say more about death and danger, Lisa. Right? L'habit ne fait pas le moine. Is that like the clothing doesn't make the person? So Sarah says, I heard once that the coat is elsewhere described as a princess's coat. Good. This is, the same word is used for the coat of the other Tamar, who's one of King David's daughters. So yes, very, very good. So they hated him for being a gender rebel. So yes, clothing is very much a way of expressing gender identity, and that can be deceptive if we're dressing in a way which isn't actually in integrity with what we actually feel our gender is. Treachery and illusion. Previously this happened with blindness. Now it happened with Isaac and his sons Jacob and Esau. Now it happens with those who can see. Very, very interesting. Great point. Good, David, that Joseph's coat is dipped in the blood to deceive Jacob. So the clothing itself is used as the vessel of deception. And in general, we clothe ourselves in order to present ourselves in a certain way, the way that we want others to think of us. Great. Oh, clothing doesn't make the monk. Right, the habit doesn't make the monk. Good. Thank you for correcting my French. Simcha says, I think there is something to the choices that are being made, and they're being really intentional with how they're presenting themselves to have what they want to have happen. Good, 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 good. All right. Lots of great ideas. Lots of great ideas here. So it seems like there's some deep ambivalence about clothing, that it conceals as much as it reveals. And it's necessary. And yet it is, as you pointed out with the issue of Adam and Eve, perhaps is always seen as being a descent from grace in a way, that if we had remained ignorant, then we wouldn't have needed clothing at all. So the clothing itself could be seen as a sign of our having messed it up somehow, possibly. Esther had her hand up. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Go ahead, Esther.
There is the expression in sheep's clothing.
A wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
It is honest people.
Right, exactly. People deliberately using clothing to present themselves as something that they're not, something safer than they are. And it's a good point that we do have a lot of emphasis in our tradition elsewhere about clothing, whether that's the clothing of the priesthood and the high priest, or the expectations of what is modest clothing, the expectations around things like tzitzit and tefillin. We also have rules about gendered clothing.
And
So
we clothes for Shabbat.
Different clothes for Shabbat. Yep, beautiful. That we wear particular clothes for particular occasions, that we do specifically on Purim. We'll represent ourselves differently. On Yom Kippur, many people wear white. On Shabbat, some people wear white. Karen points out that Leah was also heavily veiled as a part of the deliberate deception of Jacob so that he would marry her first. Talis and Yarmulke. Beautiful. Great. So someone pointed out already that the word that's used for Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat in the phrase that's used in Tanakh is Kohenet pasim. Kohenet is a tunic that's fairly uncontroversial. Pasim, unclear what the word pasim really means. It probably means something like stripes or strips in its basic meaning. So, but as we'll see, there are many different ways to interpret what this pasim might mean, and the rabbi, this is a good example of some drush work. They they like to play. And let's see what they have to say about that. I'll share my screen so that you can, oops, so that you can see. Okay. So somebody already, so this is, as I said, I don't know how to say what's Remez and what's Drush, but somebody already pointed out the connection between the Kohenet Pasim, as Joseph has, and the one that Amnon and Tamar have, that Tamar has another garment similarly to a princess's robe. And somebody else, Rashi, this is Rashi pointing out that karpas, the fine linen, karpas utchelet in the Purim story, the pas of karpas is like pasim. So here Rashi says it means a garment of fine wool. It doesn't necessarily mean striped, it doesn't necessarily mean colorful, but it means that it was very fine fabric. So a very rich fabric. Similarly, this Forno, who's a Renaissance commentator, points out that in the book of Isaiah, it's the clothing you in a tunic is a sign of royalty. God promises to clothe the king in a particular tunic. And in general, he kind of makes the point that this is a visible sign of Joseph's elevated status, and that his father intended him to be the ruler of his brothers. There's also a very interesting legend in the Talmud where the idea is that Joseph is hesitating when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And at that moment, he sees the face of his father appear before him, saying, "Don't mess this up. You're going to mess up your spiritual inheritance if you do this thing you're not allowed to do." But specifically, he uses the image of the high priest's clothing, which is interesting too, how there's this resonance of not just the royal clothing, but the priestly clothing. He says, your brothers' names will all be on the breastplate of the high priest. Do you want to lose the chance for your name to be there too? Okay, and then we see also more unpacking of the word pasim in these various plays from Genesis Rabbah, the great compilation of midrashim on Bereshit. So here we can see a lot of wordplay. It says he made for him a striped tunic, tunic pasim. One rabbi says pasim, for it reached the palm or pas of his hand. Or alternatively, it was so thin and light that you could bundle it up and just hold it in your hand. You know, when you have a really, really fine fabric that like silk, it can compress very, very small. Somebody else says pasim, they cast lots. Payas is post-biblical Hebrew for lots, to decide who would take it to their father and tell Jacob that Joseph, or imply to Jacob that Joseph had been killed. Because you'll notice that actually they don't say Joseph has been killed, they show him the cloak with the blood and say, do you recognize this? And Jacob makes the associative leap and says, yes, I recognize this. Surely Joseph's been torn up by a wild beast. He must be dead. And then I rather like this one. There's an interpretation that says the word pasim is actually an acronym that stands for the various parties that Joseph was sold to. Pa for Potiphar, Sa for the Sochrim or traders, Ya for the Yishmaelim, and Ma for the Midianim. So it's a nice play on words, a close reading of the text, that he goes through these various stages, and that his coat of many colors, or his coat of many parts, many stripes, somehow connects to his fate, which will be to move through many different states and stages. And I don't like this one quite as much, but someone else reads pasim as pas yam, like the strips of the sea, and connects it to the idea of the Red Sea being split ultimately, and the coat then is a prefiguring of the Israelites going down into Egypt and what befell them there. So as you can see, various ideas about what the pasim might mean. Another one, Gershuny, another medieval commentator, says he connects the word pasim with payas or payes, which is to appease. It's the same as the English word appease, right? So he says that Jacob gave him this coat of pasim, of appeasement, to try to console him for being half orphaned, that his mother had died. Which is kind of an interesting psychological read. Jacob tried to compensate him by having a costly garment made for him. So before we go on, anyone want to say anything? It is very sad and touching. Anyone want to share anything? Let's just give a sec to see if there's anyone who hasn't shared anything yet who wants to speak. And let's also wait for folks to post into the chat if they. Someone points out that the clothing of the Torah's scrolls we also changed during the year. And we'll see in a little bit, we have the idea of the covering of the ark and the covering, the curtain between the temple and the Holy of Holies as another garment. Esther, you wanted to say something?
Some of the rabbis says that it was silk, and silk comes from tolat. So tolat can be done for good and for bad.
Say more about tolat.
Tolat, the silk is made out of the tolat, so the tolat is like a germ that it produces the silk, which is beautiful, but it also can produce like the venom of the.
Right. And it's used as an expression for like the rot and putrefaction after death as well. So like it's a maggot. Yeah, the silkworm is also a maggot. So we have this beautiful, this sort of double resonance of it. It can be good, it can be bad. Great. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so this is a lightning dash through some of these ideas. I did think that this, and this is why I particularly made the point about Tamar taking the pledge from Judah. Here's another example of the drush approach, which is where two episodes are juxtaposed with each other. So here in the stone edition of the Chumash, the commentator points out that when Tamar says to Judah, "Do you recognize these items?" she's saying back to him exactly what he had said to his father all those years ago, trying to deceive him about what had happened to Joseph. So it says, in asking that Judah identify his items, and thus his sexual liaison with Tamar, the words used are the same as the ones used by Judah as he brings Joseph's bloodied coat to Jacob to identify. The image of measure for measure comes up in the commentaries. As the Talmud notes in Sotah 10b, God repaid Judah measure for measure. With this expression, do you identify, if you please, is this your son's tunic or not? Judah had caused his father Jacob untold anguish. Tamar now confronted Judah with that same expression, and its impact registered strongly upon him. So that's pretty interesting, right? So idea of a direct payback, how the same phrase is being used to show or to point out that there may have been an opportunity for some moral development in the character of Judah. Anything that anyone would like to say about any of this before we get into the sod, the mystery level, which is personally my favorite? Sarah says that one loses a son and one gains one, but in fact, Judah loses two sons. Mm-hmm. and eventually gains another one. But yeah, it's pretty interesting, huh? Right, yeah, and then he gains a son who is also, if you remember, identified as being the ancestor of King David, who is the ancestor of the Messianic line. So this liaison between Judah and Tamar is the beginning of a very important bloodline. All right, so I'm glad we still have 15 minutes to get into some of the more mystical or psychological material, the sod, the spiritual and subtle intimations. So we already noted this kind of curious linguistic connection between beged and bagad, the clothing and deception. There's more here. There's a lot more here. One of the things I like to read the wonderful commentaries on the Torah written by Rabbi David Wolfblank. In the last few years of his life, he each week would produce a sheet of commentaries, usually sort of like 2 sides of a piece of paper, filled with all sorts of really interesting ideas, the Hasidic commentaries and psychological stuff, and his own very interesting approach. You can find some of it online, and you can, if you are taken by them, you can actually write to his widow, and she'll send you the books. So this is something from one of those that I think is quite interesting, where he says TVs and stereograms. Actually, let me see if I can get the version that where I can see what number source it is. Well, anyway, it's on the screen. Sorry. I just want to see it in its normal fashion. Thank you. All right. Spiritually, a garment is like a filter that enables the denizens of the lower world to perceive a subtle light, much as a television set enables one to see TV waves which would otherwise be invisible. So I find this very interesting. Rather than seeing a garment as something that cloaks and obscures, he's saying a garment can be something that makes visible what would otherwise be invisible. And as I mentioned before, he says, this is the reason for the curtain which separates between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the temple, and the curtain hanging in front of the Torah ark in every synagogue, to act as a receiving and filtering mechanism, to enable the subtle light within the Holy of Holies to channel outwards. This is also the purpose of wearing the talit on Shabbat. All of these are spiritual devices whereby the conduit of holy light is made more visible to us. So that's pretty interesting, I think, this idea of a garment can make visible what would otherwise be invisible. And in particular, we mentioned this before, but the connection between these garments and the garment that we wear for prayer, the talit. I want to bring this is the image of the hermit from the Noble Tarot, which was created in 1650. There's a very, very interesting website, torahtarot.com, if you're at all interested in such matters, where the creator goes through very systematically, in my view, very convincingly, showing how this was not the very first tarot deck. It was about 100 years later than the first tarot deck, but the images are much transformed, and he says it's all it was a method for Jews, for crypto Jews who were hiding that they were still Jewish, to be able to transmit Jewish knowledge while under the threat of the Inquisition. And this card, the Hermit, represents, amongst other things, the talit, and you can actually see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see the shape of the tet in the talit. And interestingly, the other main symbol of the card is the lantern, and usually the Hermit card is interpreted as being about meditation on one's inner light, on spiritual light. So interesting that resonance of the talit as a way to channel or hold spiritual light is also reflected in this card. I just thought it's been an interesting possibly an interesting thing for some folks to explore. And then, as I want to just come back to this idea of the original garments, of the way that clothing and nakedness functions in the story of the garden. So we already pointed out that the two. I'll read it in Hebrew. We're in source 31, I think. Yeah, we're in. I think that's source 31, just backwards. In Hebrew it says, "V'hiyu shnehem arumim." The two of them were arumim. They were naked. Adam v'ishto, the human and his woman. V'lo yitposhashu. They were not ashamed. They felt no shame. V'hanachash haya arum. So you notice that word. They were naked, arumim, and the serpent was arum. So it's usually translated as cunning or shrewd, but again, it's a very interesting textual resonance. That word's the same as the word for nakedness, or at least it looks the same as the word for nakedness. So the snake was the most naked of all of the creatures of the field, which the Lord God had made. And then the snake, as you may remember, says, is it really true that you're not supposed to eat of this trees, and so on and so forth. And then when they hear God walking, the voice of God moving in the garden, and God calls to them, Adam replies, I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid. And God says to them, who told you you were naked? How do you know you're naked? And then at the very end of the story, when God is pushing them out of the garden, Vayas Hashem Elokim la'Adam u'le'ishto, kotanot, same word as with Joseph, and God, the Lord God made for the human and his woman tunics of or, tunics of skin, garments of skin, v'yalbishem, and clothed them. So pretty interesting, and I didn't bring the verse, but in between they've made for themselves garments of fig leaves. So, any thoughts about these garments and how clothing and nakedness shed light on the story of Joseph and his brothers? Harry Potter. I'm afraid I'm not versed enough in pop culture to know how Harry Potter uses garments. So someone, I'm sure many of you know more. Please explain. Very good question, Sarah. Whose skin? Whose skin were they clothed in? There are midrashim that go into it, that God made some extra animals on the side whose skin he could take to clothe them. But another interpretation is that the human beings got their own skin, that before that they were incorporeal in a way, and that we were clothed in skin only to be able to go out into what we would think of as the world. Greta, can we... Yes,
Thank
please.
you. I wanted to circle to that idea of the own human skin because I've been reading this book by Delphine Orveilleux. She's a French rabbi in Paris, and she has this wonderful book, I actually have it right here, about nudity and modesty in the Torah. And she has this beautiful quote that I'm translating from French on the spot, so I apologize if it's not the best, but she says, the fall in Eden corresponds to a loss, not a loss of naivety, but a loss of our original and luminous translucent state and a movement into a world of obscurity and shadow, which I think is really beautiful. And this idea of garments as obscuring and hiding and moving away from our, I guess, interconnectivity with the world, our inability to hide things.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I gather the book is only in French, but perhaps you could put the title and the author in the chat for anyone who has the power to read it. Yes, please, Esther. I think you have to unmute yourself. Esther? Thank you.
Yeah, my comment is not about the clothing, but the talit. which reminds me the Herzl in the first Jewish Congress took the colors of the talit to make the Jewish flag.
Very nice connection. Yes, absolutely, that's it. And we might remember that the techelet, the color of the blue in the talit, in the book of Exodus, the revelation at Sinai, is described as being blue, like the sea, which is like the sky, which is like the footstool of God. So we have all these sort of symbolic resonances seen through a color, and as you point out, indeed our ketonet pasim, a garment with a stripe on it or with stripes on it. Very nice. And those who are familiar with the Jewish renewal movement may have seen the rainbow talit that Reb Zalman designed, in which he was specifically riffing on this idea and also saying in these days we're not just blue and white Jews or black and white Jews, but we need all of the colors of the rainbow represented. Simcha, please.
Thank you. I really love the idea of when God said let there be light, and then there was light, and then he separated night and day, right? And it's like their souls, and cool, you need skin, there's something about how we're separated to be able to leave the Garden of Eden, right? We need to have some sort of protection. And I start to think of garments and how we protect it. I keep going to the deceit and how it's talked about. So I want to say a cuss word, but so crappy, about everyone doing wrongdoings. I get curious of what if they were doing the best that they could to have the result that happens that's for the greatest good of all, right? Is it really deceit, and is it really treachery, or is it magic, right? And I get really curious about that, because someone's always going to be doing something that's eating an apple from a tree you're not supposed to, right? There's always going to be that thing happening. And so I think it's interesting how much we emphasize our garments as people, and also how much illusion is behind it. But then also it's separation, individualism, of we're all one, but we all need skin. We all need to have our own space and our own intentions. And I get really curious about that third space of if our garments help us to connect to that third level of between divine and our knowledge of where we are really intentional, and create an altar on ourselves and around ourselves. How are the garments of our life being tended to with intention? Because we have so much tradition and so many beautiful ways of art of we're here to create heaven on earth. So of course we're concerned about how things look, because we want it to be beautiful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so much there. Wonderful. And as to the idea of the third space, I think it's interesting to notice that the Hebrew word panim, or face, is plural. One way to understand it is the inside of, it's symmetrical, but there's the inside of the face and the outside of the face. Similarly, the garment has an inside and an outside, plus the garment itself, which is sort of a transistor. And as people have been saying in the chat, garments are not a bad thing. We need garments, whether the environments we're in are very hot and we need protection from the sun, or the environments we're in are very cold and we need protection from the cold. We do need garments. And there's nothing bad or wrong. It's interesting how they're multivalent. There's one final idea that I would love to bring in. And you may have heard of this idea that Rabbi Meir, who was one of the greatest of all the rabbis, in fact, it was said that his Torah was so great that nobody could understand it. His teaching was on such a different level that they knew he was right, but the law didn't follow him. He was one of the great early rabbis. He apparently, and Julie, who's a Soferet, I'm sure knows lots about this, there's this legend that this tradition that he had his own Torah scroll, and it had certain small differences in it from the conventional Torah scroll. And so we read in Bereshit Rabbah that where it says that the Lord God made garments of skin, kotanot or, with an ayin, garments of skin, for Adam and his woman, and clothed them. In the Torah of Rabbi Meir, it was written kotanot or, with an aleph. So you can hear it's the same, sounds the same. But Kohenet or with an aleph means garments of light, as opposed to garments of skin. And I love this midrash. I think it's wonderfully weird and strange. And then the rabbis will start riffing on like, what does it mean, Kohenet or? And some of them are like, it's like very fine linen, or some of them go in a very like literal direction. But some of them say it was like a torch shedding radiance, so narrow at the top and broad at the bottom. So it sort of sees it as this aura of sorts. And Yitzchak the elder said they were as smooth as a fingernail and as radiant as a jewel, or radiant as a pearl. So kind of strange and mysterious and mystical images for these skins of the first humans. We are pretty much at the end of our time together, so I just want to give us one more minute for anyone to chime in with anything that they want to say. Lisa says garments of light reminds her of dissident communities like the Essenes at Qumran, who spoke of becoming a shining one again, returning to the original created state. So I see definitely resonances with what you were saying, Simcha, and of course what the French rabbi was writing about as well. And Sarah, please briefly, because we're almost at time.
I just wanted to say hi to you. It's been years, so hi. It's been a long time.
Hi. Thank
I
you.
saw you. I was like, oh, cool. I haven't heard. Yeah. Anyway, good to see you after so many years. Life is good.
Thank you.
I sent
Great.
Julie my email. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, Esther, you get to have the last word. Thank you for sharing so much insight with us today.
Well, I like the idea of light, because light plays such an important part in the Torah and in life. Like God created the world with light. We have Shabbat with light. We have the Havdalah with light. We have Hanukkah with light. And I'm thinking of Plato, like we say, I saw the light, I understand. And Plato in his Republic, the light at the end of the tunnel. So light is very symbolic and very important.
Beautiful. And in fact, you're not going to have the last word because that gives me a couple of things to say. One is, in Plato's analogy of a cave, it's actually seeing the shadows that give the people the idea. So the light is a means also to cast shadow. And it reminds me of one time being in this beautiful forest of birch trees, which were almost as slender as all the shadows passing between them. And I asked myself, why does everything need to have a shadow? Which is a very interesting spiritual question too. Why does everything need to have a shadow? And the answer came to me, because that's how you know it's actually there. If you didn't have the shadow, it would be that's the way of seeing that something's insubstantial if it's not casting a shadow. So one final thing that it comes to me to say with this idea of everything being created through light is the idea, again, coming back to Julie and your scholars of Seferet, that the Torah is black fire written on white fire. And in fact, that the white spaces, the negative space of the Torah, is as much the transmission, and that the transmission that continues to evolve and come through in each of our generations and between everybody who ever sits to study Torah is coming through that light of what's behind the black fire, the even deeper white fire of the Torah. So I thank you so much for being here to share in this Torah today. You're very welcome to print these source sheets or look at them further, maybe study them over Shabbat. And I hope that this has been thought-provoking on at least one level that gets you, and that it brings more holiness and intention and awareness to the act of dressing and how we choose to present ourselves in the world. So with that, I will wish you a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Chanukah Sameach. I hope the beginning of Chanukah is absolutely beautiful and the light only continues to grow.